There is a commonly held belief among the poor in Morrowind that the priests of the temple don't spare nearly as much effort on aiding the infirm and destitute as they did in the days when Almalexia walked amongst the people. Now she and many others who once dedicated their lives to lifting the impoverished are seldom involved in their former mission. Morrowind is a land governed by a delicate power balance between the tradition of the esteemed Dunmer noble houses of antiquity and the insisting cosmopolitan reign of the Empire. For hundreds of years, the Dark Elves and Cirids have jockeyed for power and influence over the peoples and lands of the province, with both systems often having practically equal validity in many parts of Morrowind. What often gets lost in the drama is how the average person is to make ends meet, an individual simply existing in a landscape full of politics, intrigue, diplomacy, and so on. And this is precisely what demands further insight, with a particular focus on how the urban poor live and how Morrowind is undergoing increasing urbanization under Imperial rule. Is there a socio-economic explanation for why I was just spat on and called a racial slur? These are some of the things I intend to investigate. If you find yourself enjoying the video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It really helps the video in the algorithm and shows appreciation for my work. And maybe also watch without ad block? YouTube has made some changes. I'm just trying to adapt over here. If you'd like to support me even more, consider checking out my Patreon, where you can vote on upcoming video topics and possibly more. And finally, check out Tamriel Rebuilt and Project Tamriel. These mod projects have done a great job in expanding the world building of Elder Scrolls, and much of my work is based on their content. Morrowind is a land of contradictions. Unsurprising to anyone that's been to Roadir and Old Ebonheart. Hard to believe sometimes that two places so different are physically quite close, less than a day's walk from each other. To someone that is struggling to get their daily bread, this difference is more or less superficial, just a different set of rules to work in. But further contradictions can be found in the lives of the common people. Lower-class people living out in the rural countryside are simultaneously the freest and most enslaved people. People in the cities are simultaneously the most likely to benefit from intra-continental trade, but also the most likely to be unable to obtain basic needs like food and shelter. While it's certainly fair to see being poor in any case, anywhere, as not ideal, it seems as if there is a difference and growing divide between the quality of life of Morrowind's urban versus its rural poor. Certain practices of both the Dunmer Great Houses and the Imperials have led to a gradual urbanization of the province. Let's look at some of the differences between urban and rural poor, as well as analyze some of the factors that push or pull people into the cities. Urban poor are most likely to be free in the sense that they are not enslaved. They are more likely to be foreigners, more likely to have a trade or vocation if employed, and generally have more employment opportunities when out of work. However, they will be in closer proximity to criminal activity. Rural poor, on the other hand, are more likely to be enslaved. If they're free, they're more likely to be involved in basic farming, fishing, hunting, etc. Most rural poor are non-foreign. You may be asking yourself, most slaves are Argonian or Khajiit. Are they not foreign? And this is a fair question. Certainly, yes, ancestrally they are foreign, but many Khajiit and Argonian slaves are descendants from generations of Morrowind-born slaves, possibly going back hundreds of years. In this way, you could make the argument they are not foreign insofar as all they know is how things are run in Morrowind, and many would consider that argument very radical and imperial in nature. Slavery is a central aspect of what is driving rural Dunmer to the cities, a process which has sped up under imperial rule. Even though slavery is illegal in imperial territory on paper, the situation on the ground is of course much different. While the armistice signed between Vivec and Tiber Septim made the Empire sovereign, Morrowind is in practice a condominium of shared powers. Slavery is permitted in land ruled by the Great Houses, and the Empire is more than willing to purchase the products that are the fruits of slave labor. As the desire for Morrowind's agriculture and raw minerals increases, so does the income of the slaveholding nobility. This increased wealth leads to an expansion of slave labor in the countryside to the point where freeholders can no longer compete. Throughout Morrowind, you'll find plantations, mines, ranches, and more, all staffed with slave labor. If you're lucky, you might be able to be a tenant farmer on a noble's land that hasn't figured out what cash crop he can grow yet. Maybe you can find work as a foreman or craftsman on a slave plantation, if you can stomach being part of such a system. However, most decide to relocate to the cities where there is at least a perception of better opportunity. But as the saying goes, the ash isn't always grayer on the other side of the Foyada. The Roth-Rorin region of Morrowind is located along the inner sea, roughly in the center of the province. It's a border region between House Hlalu and House Redoran. Roth-Rorin is a region lacking in arable land due to its rocky and rough terrain. However, its hills are rich with minerals and Quama colonies. I did not come to Roth-Rorin for no good reason. I wanted to use a specific example to show how Morrowind's urbanization works on the ground. Adjacent to the Roth-Rorin region is the Antharin region, which is more or less the lands along the northern half of the Thur River. The west bank of the Thur River is dominated by Hlalu slave plantations. It is nearly impossible to take a step here on soil that isn't owned by a chattel-possessing noble. If you were to be born a free person here, not tied to a great house, there aren't too many employment opportunities for you. You may head down the river, trying your luck in Old Ebonheart, or heading to Balfoyen in Roth-Rorin. In its own right, you'll still find this plantation economy in Roth-Rorin. The region has 2 plantations and 1 distillery using slave labor. And this is still one of the regions where slavery is less prevalent. Most of the major settlements I've noticed actually have little to no slaves. There are some regions of Morrowind, particularly in Induril or Dress territory, where almost every settlement is a slave plantation or mine. Still, despite all of this, it's quite difficult to find free resource gathering operations in Roth-Rorin. Only a couple small mines and farmsteads have no slaves. There's even a few people that have carved out cave dwellings to live in, but these people are not doing much beyond surviving. Anyone looking to maybe live a more fruitful and comfortable life turns to cities like Balfoyen. Balfoyen is a fairly important Hlaalu-controlled city. It is the only major Hlaalu port on the Inner Sea. Shipping down the Third River to Narcissus means having to deal with tolls and inspections along the river's choke points in places like Almsivi and Al Yuval. The port of Balfoyen is often a more desirable stopover for Hlaalu merchants and associates looking to keep as many pieces of the pie for themselves as possible. House Hlaalu has made Balfoyen an attractive place for the Imperials to inhabit. The heights on the western side of the city houses manors owned by Imperial nobles, an Imperial cult chapel, and an Imperial commission. The Imperial Commission is a judicial establishment where an Imperial-appointed magistrate dictates various legal cases regarding Imperial law, as well as act as a sort of legal liaison between the Empire and House Hlaalu. The Commission also doubles as a Legion base. If you're looking for mercenary work, the Legion has an assortment of bounties available. But personally, I feel 1,000 septims isn't really worth going after a murderous cannibal called the Bone Eater. Built into the mountains on the southern side of the city is the estate of Tholar Andas. Tholar Andas is one of the wealthiest and most influential of the Hlaalu councillors. The Andas family makes the majority of its wealth from the mining industry, and Tholar is infamous for his miserliness. Tholar has a habit of paying his workers in Hlaalu company scrip in lieu of actual gold. This scrip is only valid currency with House Hlaalu associated merchants. If you're getting paid in this stuff, you've no true financial freedom, or freedom of movement outside of Hlaalu territory. One of Tholar Andas's mines was once an imperial penal colony, where criminals could serve their sentences mining iron as recompense for their offenses to the Ruby Throne. However, Tholar came to purchase the mine with a cousin of his overseeing operations. You may assume that the Imperial prisoners there would be transferred elsewhere or perhaps freed. Well, I have a bridge in Almsivi to sell you. The former prisoners remain laboring in the mine, but are paid with the aforementioned Hlaalu company's scrip. Despite the change in management, the prisoners are still more or less stuck in the same situation as before. Practices like this from Balfoyen's nobility have of course created a destitute underclass in the city. In many other cities, this underclass finds refuge in the sewers. However, Balfoyen notably has no sewer system. But they do have these wonderful water features. Great if you're a fan of morning swims. Wait, if there's no sewer system, where is the waste going exactly? I'm gonna be sick. Instead of sewers, the homeless are relegated to a Dunmer ruin adjacent to the city. The ruins of Bethwangtov. I think I figured out why the Dwemer disappeared. It had nothing to do with the divine tools or the heart of a god. They came up with a word so ridiculous and difficult to pronounce that their entire race evaporated at the mere mental process of saying this word. To make matters worse, for the people seeking shelter here, they aren't even living inside the ruin. They're making camp outside, next to whatever this liquid is. It's too dangerous to be inside unexplored Dunmer ruins, as Dunmer traps and automatons are often still very much active. For the working poor of the city, employment can be found in one of the several guilds and shops. One could also find some work for the local nobles or imperial magistrate, but these jobs often require years of experience in apprenticeships or the right connections. While the living from these jobs certainly isn't amazing, it's often enough to keep a roof over your head and food on the table. But not everyone is so lucky to even find steady work like this. So the question remains, how do you survive as a poor urbanite? One of, if not the largest organization that can provide a safety net for the poor is the Tribunal Temple. In most Dunmer cities and holy sites, you'll find a temple-run hostel. These temple hostels are primarily for pilgrims in need of short-term lodgings and basic meals when visiting one of the many shrines of the Dunmer religion. These hostels, in many cases, also provide the same amenities for the poor that are not necessarily on a pilgrimage. While in most of these cases, the temple is more inclined to care for fellow Dunmer of the same faith, it's not totally out of the ordinary for an outlander to be cared for. In addition to these hostels, the temple also runs a number of infirmaries. Not all infirmaries, however, are dedicated to caring after the destitute. For example, the infirmary of Serinthul, located not far from the walls of Old Ebonheart, specializes in caring for unwell ordinators and temple priests. But many infirmaries still open their doors to any afflicted by disease, injury, or even addiction. The city of Narcissus boasts two tribunal sites, the Shrine of the Hidden Saints and the Eight Bones Temple. The larger of the two is the Eight Bones Temple, which houses a holy relic, Muatra, Lord Vivek's spear, which is said to have the ability to turn anything it touches into dust and bone. With Muatra, Vivek slew the ancient enemies of the Dunmer's ancestors. According to some legends, less amicable to the living gods, the spear slew Indiril Nerevar in a foul act of betrayal following the Battle of Red Mountain, as he would oppose the tribunal's use of the Heart of Lorkhan to become godlike themselves. This is a belief still held by many of the unsettled Dunmer Ashlander tribes, who still cling to a traditional life as civilization encroaches all around them. This is, of course, a purely academic exploration of the topic, and I am in no way endorsing the narrative that Almsivi did anything untoward following the Battle of Red Mountain. Best not to be too careful. Many Outlanders have disappeared for saying less. The other temple in Narcissus, well, shrine, I suppose, is the Shrine of the Hidden Saints. This much more modest establishment, located in the city's market quarter, is specifically oriented towards charity and aiding the poor. The priests and acolytes of this shrine make particular efforts in outreach to those affected by drug abuse, regularly providing medicine to those suffering from the effects of excessive skooma use and withdrawals. Disciples of the Hidden Saints even venture into the Narcissus sewers to provide this aid, setting up makeshift havens for worship and charity deep where the city's most desperate reside, often collaborating with the Beggar Tong. The Beggar Tong, from what I can see, is a sort of informal association of paupers living in the sewer that generally watch each other's backs. The Narcissus sewers in particular are home to more than just impoverished, but all kinds of dangers, both mundane and exotic. Violent gangs, drug addicts. I've even heard whispers of vampires and Daedric cults taking up residence down here. Some parts of the sewers are so ancient and neglected. Who really has any idea what could be found? One has to give credit to the brave priests that very much risk their lives to perform their duties in a place like this. While the temple does what it can for the poor in cities run by the great houses, it's more than worth looking at how the temple handles poverty in an actual temple-run city. Vivec is such a city, named in honor of the living god Vivec, who made the city his home. The origins of the city are shrouded in mystery, with its initial date of founding not certain. But we do know that the city was built sometime before or shortly after the Battle of Red Mountain. Regardless of when the first settlers arrived to the area, Vivec made the site his residence, and pilgrims came from far and wide to make the journey to Vivec's palace. As more pilgrims came to witness their living god, the temple canton was constructed to accommodate them. Resulting from this naturally came businesses to trade with these pilgrims, and from that, the first permanent community in the area. 2 more cantons would be constructed, the St. Alms and St. Delen cantons. Not willing to be left out, the great houses of Redoran, Hlalu, and Telvanni would soon have cantons of their own. With the arrival of the Empire, so came a canton for the foreigners. Of course, there's the Arena Canton too. I mean, who doesn't love a little blood sports in their holy city?
Is there something you need?
Actually, yes. I'd like some Cyrodiilic brandy. The cantons we're most concerned with at the moment are the 2 original cantons besides the temple itself, the St. Alms and St. Delen cantons. The original purpose of these cantons, of course, was to house the vast numbers of pilgrims here to see Vivec. Today, in essence, this is still the case, but the scope of these cantons has also increased over the centuries. The saintly cantons provide more permanent low-income housing and affordable business space for the city's long-since permanent non-pilgrim population. It's worth noting that these cantons still have manors, some of which are owned by foreigners, so the housing space set aside for the impoverished is limited. I can only imagine how long the waiting list is for something like this. I can also see how corruption and nepotism could affect whatever process or lottery decides who can live in these cantons. Maybe that's just my inner pessimist talking. Maybe the proximity to their boss, Vivec, forces temple housing authorities to judge fairly. I mean, how much time and effort does Vivec spend making sure this rock doesn't smash into Nirn and kill us all? Like, how involved is he in the temple administration? Does he get the final word on who can become a temple patriarch? Can one petition him to make changes in temple governance or doctrine? Many questions left unanswered. Narcissus, Vivec City, both examples of places where you can find a strong presence of temple charity catered to supporting Morrowind's poor. But the temple priests in these cities, and several others in the province, enjoy a decent level of cooperation with the great houses to deal with the poverty question. This is not the case in many parts of Morrowind. Some masters pay no mind to struggling subjects of theirs, in some instances even adding to the misery. No place better demonstrates this scenario than in the lands of House Telvanni. In the lands controlled by House Telvanni, you'll find the dynamic between the upper and lower classes to be different. The same in a way, but different. Different in a different way. Apologies for confusing you, but the way the Telvanni rule is so enigmatic, it's often quite hard to put into words. On paper, the Telvanni, like all other great houses, are subjects of the Empire. But what is written down on paper in no way reflects reality. When Vivek signed the armistice with Tiber Septim, he did so on behalf of Morrowind and the Dunmer people. But despite being a living god, the whole province is not exactly under his command. Telvanni wizards do not regard the tribunal as the other houses do, often rejecting their godhood entirely. Some Telvanni may respect Almsivi as peers in a way, but one must understand that a Telvanni wizard can be older than the divinity of the tribunal and battle of Red Mountain. This power and stubbornness of the Telvanni have made their lands truly some of the most independent in Morrowind, possibly in all of Tamriel. The average working Dunmer living in their domain cannot expect the same kind of relationship with their superiors that is found anywhere else in the province. Where a noble is likely in any given region to be more powerful than the people they rule, they still must consider their well-being and support them to some extent to stay in power. With the Telvanni, this really isn't the case. If a Telvanni tower has a community forming around it with shops, trade, industry, administration, etc., it's because the resident wizard tolerates or is not aware of said community's existence. There are, of course, exceptions, and the involvement of Telvanni nobles, or lack thereof, is on a spectrum. But me personally, I feel like I can never really rest easy in this part of Morrowind. You're walking into an unpredictable situation anytime you hop off a silt strider to look upon one of these fungal towers. Late in the latter half of the First Era, one of the greatest threats to Tamriel lay far overseas to the east in Akavir. Tamriel and Morrowind alike would be the victim of multiple Akaviri invasions, which climaxed in First Era 2703, when Remen I, Emperor of Cyrodiil, defeated the largest historical invasion of Akavir at the Pale Pass, subjugating and syncretizing the Akaviri remnants. While Morrowind avoided the brunt of these invasions, it was not unscathed by the Akaviri onslaught. Built into the jagged cliffs along the shores of Lake Boethia, the temple stronghold and monastery of Tel Mathrivra fell to Akaviri attackers. Following the recession of Akaviri power, the temple would not return to reoccupy its former strongpoint. Tel Mathrivra would fall into a period of neglect, with only a handful of stubborn priests, barely keeping the lanterns lit. Eventually, an opportunistic Telvanni mage lord would purchase the grounds from the temple, turning it into the site of his tower. The roots of the tower almost seem to choke out the Velothi architecture of the original temple make. One day, the tower will fully burst through the old dome and rise high above the settlement. The new master of Telmoth Rivra cares very little for the people living in and around the stronghold. Only one temple priest, Lothus Draelor, remains, seeing it as his holy duty to care for the people living under a callous yoke. They don't care about the temple, traditions, or the poor and weak. They are only interested in themselves and their profane studies. Draelor shows quite a bit of sympathy for the regular folk living here. In many regards, he's the only hope the poor of Telmoth Rivra have to survive. He's the only healer around. Apparently, the Lord of Telmoth Rivra has a penchant for necromancy. Something tells me it would be unwise to seek your Lord's aid if you were even remotely close to ailing, lest you become another one of his undead minions. While I was checking out the temple hostel in Almsivi, the priests became active, rushing about with an Induril-style amulet, asking any of the pilgrims and beggars if they recognized it. The amulet was worn by a corpse of a young Dunmer male fished out of the river earlier this morning. A pilgrim that came from the west journeying across Velas Path recognized the amulet and confirmed the owner's identity. The amulet belonged to Aldum Sorvas, a young Mer, barely of adult age, from the nearby village of Selen. Selen is a small rural hamlet on the Induril side of the Thur River, one of the several small settlements in the area bound to the Roadir chapelry. Peasants born to Selen and many other farm communities in the Induril feudal chapel system live very simple lives as sustenance farmers, providing labor and goods for their local lord in return for security. As you'd expect, this lifestyle is unbecoming for many Dunmer, especially in a time where there are so many increasingly successful enterprising entities, like the Imperials and Hlalu. Traditional Induril life has been in steep decline since the Imperial subjugation of Morrowind. Deep in Induril territory, such as in the Hlan Arethan forest or the Nidithril coast, the old Dunmer ways are still very much the norm. Induril nobles live in ornate manners, living off the wealth of their mines in plantations staffed by slaves. Dunmer, unfortunate enough not to be born to the nobility, make modest lives working the land or running small businesses. But this is a world deeply out of touch with the rest of Morrowind. For the peasants, things like imperial rule, something only heard about in the abstract and never witnessed personally. But for our deceased friend Aldum Sorvas, being on the edge of Induril territory means he had some options. When Aldum came of age, he decided to move to the Hlalu town of Hlan Oek, seeking greater economic opportunity. I've met a few people here before who were also enticed to the town for the same reason. It is a town where one can find work in many different industries or benefit from the trade that flows through the area. But of course, it is not always that simple. Hlan Oek, while seemingly on the up and up, is still a small place, and there's a lot of competition between economic migrants and the local poor. Aldum Sorvas, like so many other Dunmer born into poverty, turned to a life of crime. The dirty little secret of Hlan Oek is that the town is firmly in the grip of the Kamonatong, the town being a hub for the skooma trade. Does that mean everyone that associates with the Kamonatong is an evil criminal? Not necessarily. The Kamona often takes advantage of society's most desperate, manipulating them with gold they never dreamed they could earn, pocket change to the Kamona Tong. It seems that Aldam, in some way or another, got involved with the Kamona Tong, saw the error of his ways, and tried to back out of a potential life of crime. However, the Kamona get to decide how you leave the life. Most of the time, that means death. Aldam Sorvas was murdered by Kamona Tong thugs, and his body dumped in the river. He floated all the way down to Almsthir, where he was eventually discovered and able to receive proper funeral rites in the Dunmer tradition. Say what you will about the Indaril's oppressive ancient traditions. Cracking down on crime is something they seem to do well. If Aldam had stayed home, he might have lived a long, if not boring, life. This is unfortunately one of the many results for the life of someone that even dabbles in Morrowind's criminal underworld. It is not Dark Elf cities alone that struggle with poverty and crime. There are a host of Imperial cities that have problems in their own right and have their own flair of dealing with said problems. As the Imperial Legion spread across Tamriel, so too did the Empire's people, the poor and downtrodden migrating to distant lands in search of economic opportunity and freedom. Morrowind is no exception to this trend, with a great many peoples in every corner of Tamriel seeking a new life in the alluring lands of the Dunmer. In the year 414 of the Third Era, the island of Vardenfell was reorganized into an imperial district and formally opened for wider settlement. Before that time, it had been governed as a special mandate by the Tribunal Temple, with only a handful of legal settlements. This opening of settlement on the island has led to a rush of immigrants seeking land and employment on the island. On the mainland, in the imperial city of Old Ebonheart, there is an Imperial Resettlement Office in one of the Ebon Castle's outer towers. The purpose of the Imperial Resettlement Office is to help citizens from all across the Empire settle underdeveloped Imperial colonies. Vardenfell, being one of the wildest parts of Morrowind, is the primary target of the Old Ebonheart office. Colonists are given a stipend and small tracts of land to farm, or guaranteed employment in an Imperial chartered company. Settlements such as Caldera and Pelagiad are some of the more popular choices for colonists, but a few elect to strike it out in the wilderness. That is how the Empire views this endeavor, a taming of the wilderness. Well, what the Empire considers wilderness is different from that of the natives.
I'm not busy now. What do you need?
One of the colonists here is hoping to get land in the fields of Kumu, good agricultural land along Lake Amaya in southern Vardenfell. The problem here, though, is that this is also a tribunal holy place, home to the Shrine of Humility. To receive the shrine's blessing, one must offer but a humble piece of muck sponge, which grows in large quantities in the area. Imagine how the Dunmer would feel if all of the muck sponge was now property of some psychotic ex-legionnaire who stabs first and asks questions later. A diplomatic incident in the making, I fear. Speaking of legionnaires, it is worth mentioning that the Legion is one of the largest employers in the province. It can be a hard and dangerous life, but food, shelter, and a pension are very enticing for those with few opportunities. The Legion is a cosmopolitan formation. It takes recruits from any and all walks of life, all in service to the Ruby Throne. Many of the larger imperial settlements have recruitment offices that will take local raw recruits. Another prominent imperial institution that expends a significant amount of resources uplifting the impoverished is the imperial cult. The imperial cult worship the traditional 8 Aedra, but also Tiber Septim, who ascended to godhood as Talos, leading to a worshipped pantheon of 9 gods. One of the Aedra, the god Stendar, is known principally as the god of charity and mercy. Followers of Stendar frequently take on the duty of aiding the poor wherever they can. The Hostel of Stendar's Mercy in Old Ebonheart provides food and temporary lodgings for those in need. Many of those seeking refuge among Stendar's followers are Argonian and Khajiit runaways, fleeing a life of chattel slavery they found themselves in Dunmer lands. Many of Tamriel's races more or less worship at least some of the gods of this Aedric pantheon, although their interpretation may differ. The Dunmer of Morrowind, however, stand unique as a race, as they entirely reject the worship of the Aedra. The Dunmer instead, of course, worship the tribunal living gods Almalexia, Vivek, and Sothasil, with persisting reverence to the 3 good Daedra, Azura, Boethia, and Mephala, which are seen as anticipations of the tribunal. As a result of these starkly different religious beliefs, the reach of the imperial cult does not exceed far beyond imperial-controlled cities, forts, and foreign quarters. Although that doesn't mean the cult isn't making an effort. In the Hlalu town of Hlarenhul, the local ruling noble Ivil Hlaren is a follower of the imperial cult, and not the tribunal. He makes generous donations of gold and real estate to the cult, a temple of Dibella being located in the town center. The Dibellans make frequent outreach to the poor of the area. Distribution of alms to the poor in nearby settlements like Ald Yuval a common enough occurrence. Beyond the religious institution of the imperial cult, imperial quarters and cities of Morrowind, despite what the letter of the law says, is a frequent refuge for runaway slaves. Diplomats of the Argonian mission, for instance, collaborate with and petition imperial authorities for the freedom of their kin, while also providing accommodations and work for runaway slaves. Many abolitionists, however, prefer to take a more dramatic, confrontational position towards slavery in Morrowind, joining the Twin Lamps organization. The Twin Lamps is an underground society of radical abolitionists dedicated to freeing slaves by any means necessary, transporting them out of Great House territory or out of Morrowind entirely. While most members of the Twin Lamps are outlanders to Morrowind, there is a minority of Dunmer who stand against their people's ancient practice of slavery. The Twin Lamps, of course, encounter most of their opposition from the Dunmer just as well. Cat catchers in the employ of the slave-holding nobility are always on the hunt for escaped slaves, capturing them for return to enslavement if possible, but also killing uncooperative runaways as an example. cat catcher as a term is a reference to Khajiit runaway slaves, but believe you me, they're going after anyone that once wore a slave bracer. Dunmer cities often have cat catcher clubs, which provide food and lodging for the ever-mobile slave hunters, while also acting as a hub for work postings. As slavery is officially legal in Morrowind according to Imperial law, cat catchers can and will venture into Imperial settlements to capture their quarry. For this reason, many of the escaped slaves in places like Old Ebonheart must go into hiding, even in the shadow of the Ebon Tower. Beneath the streets of Old Ebonheart, the city's paupers find refuge. Ugh, do I really have to go to the sewers again? Why do I have to do an expose on the worst things about Morrowind? Instead of investigating criminals and drug addicts, why can't it be playing cards and eating a big sweet roll? Sorry about that. The beggars of Imperial settlements like Old Ebonheart, just like their Dunmer counterparts, find refuge in the sewers away from any eyes on the surface. Similar to the Beggar's Tongue in Narcissus, it seems the poor here have organized somewhat for mutual protection. The paupers here mention the existence of a beggar king and direct me toward a throne room. This place would almost be cozy if it weren't for the dampness and giant rats. A fair amount of people in the sewers are hiding from the law. A no-brainer if you need a place to hide or lay low for a while. However, life in the sewers is pretty rough. I must admit, I think I would rather be caught by the law in Imperial lands. There's a higher likelihood to get a trial or avoid corporal punishment with service in the Legion or at a penal colony. Morrowind doesn't really have many long-term prisoners. Very high-profile criminals may be locked away for life, but most of the time you're spending a short time in a cell until you're faced with your punishment. Not every prison is built equal, with the ability to even detain someone for the long term. Larger prisons may have magical disruptors that prevent teleportation, but most just slap a bracer on you to prevent the use of magicka. That still won't stop someone on the outside from slipping you an intervention scroll to your freedom. Well, you wouldn't exactly be free yet. You'd be a fugitive, unable to show your face in public. But hey, at least you'd still be welcome down in the sewers. What started off as a naive look into the lives of Morrowind's poor ended up a convoluted analysis of many topics I didn't imagine to detail. Urbanization, the decline of serfdom, colonialism, the role of the clergy, etc. All of which go hand in hand with the understanding of poverty in this unique province. Thank you for watching the video all the way to the end. If you haven't already done so, consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. It helps the video in the algorithm quite a bit, and I'm very thankful for any support. Check out the Patreon if you want to support the channel even more. At the time this video is out, there should be a new poll for video topics that patrons can vote on. Shout out to Curate of the Patreon, Brandy Hutzel. Thanks again, and I'll see you soon.